Hello, I'm Jim Leaviss from M&G Investments, and I'm here in the latest of our series of interviews with authors on economic topics. Today I'm here with Robert J. Gordon, Professor Robert J. Gordon from Northwestern University. He's written this new book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And it's received a lot of attention this year for a number of reasons, but most importantly, it's an antidote to a lot of the techno-optimism that we see around the world at the moment. You know, people like Elon Musk and SpaceX and Apple, all the great things happening in technology, Bob here thinks perhaps haven't had such an important contribution to growth as we might hope for. Hello, Bob.
Hi.
So, thinking about your book, you don't believe that the growth that we've experienced in recent years has been driven by technological advance in the way that the century before 1970 we did see innovation being really important.
The big difference is that before 1970, going back to the Civil War of 1870, we had a remarkable century in which life absolutely changed in every dimension for ordinary people. We had the invention of electricity, the change in the household from scrub boards to electric washing machines. We had the invention of the internal combustion engine and the motor car and air travel. We had clean running water coming to the house instead of having to be carried in pails. We had the eradication of infectious diseases. We had the extension of life expectancy made possible by the conquest of infant mortality. Just so many different dimensions of human life were changed. And one way to wrap it up is that in 1870, an average home was completely isolated. By 1940, it was connected in 5 different ways, with electricity, gas, telephone, running water, and waste disposal, things that didn't exist back in 1870. So when we compare technological change over the last 30 or 40 years, yes, we've had the digital revolution, and we've had a complete change in the way offices work, from typewriters through flat screens and word processing programs, but they've affected a narrower span of life. If we walked into today's kitchen, it's very familiar to those who were there in 1950. There's not been much of a change at all except for the invention of the microwave oven. So it's the dimension, the breadth of the change that was so much greater back before 1970.
And what we see is that total factor productivity today is much lower than it's been in most of the recent economic history.
I've got to correct you. It's the growth of total factor productivity. The level of productivity, of course, continues to go up. The question is, at what speed? And there's no comparison in that the growth of total factor productivity, that means how efficiently our economy is using its labor and its capital, has been growing much slower over the last 40 years than it did over the previous 50. And productivity growth in particular over the last decade has been extremely disappointing. We had a good period back in the late 1990s when the productivity payoff of the digital revolution, the internet, the invention of the personal computer all came together and made total factor productivity grow rapidly. But that was pretty much over by 2004. We've now gone more than 10 years with very, very modest growth.
I mean, techno-optimists would say, just wait, that in your book you talk about Edison starting the first power plant in, was it Pearl Street in Manhattan in the end of that century, and yet it wasn't for another couple of decades before homes in Manhattan had electric lighting. And the optimists would say, we've invented the internet. At the moment, we're using it to book holidays and play Angry Birds, not at M&G obviously, but at other fund management houses. Yeah. But we haven't really worked out how to use technology, how to use mobile phones and the internet and all of these things to really make a difference. Do you believe that in 10 years' time we'll be looking back and saying, actually, we just didn't know what we were doing with this stuff?
No, I think actually your analogy is correct, that it took about 40 years for the invention of electricity to make its way into manufacturing and to really bring its productivity payoff, which did come in the 1920s and 1930s. In the case of computers, we had mainframe computers introduced in the 1960s and 1970s. We got their payoff with a delay in the 1990s and early 2000s. So what we're seeing now is the rolling out of mobile phones Much of the use of mobile phones is not for business use, but for consumers with their social networks, with YouTube, with a new kind of use of time for leisure, so that people, instead of looking at TV, now look at TV while they're also surveying their social networks on their phones. It's another form of leisure, but not affecting deeply the way businesses operate.
And another, perhaps counter to your argument, is that we're just simply not measuring GDP growth and productivity properly. You know, in this world, Diane Coyle's written a paper recently called Digitally Disrupted GDP, which very strongly argues that we're underestimating growth and perhaps overestimating things like inflation, because we just can't capture improvements through things like the free Wikipedia and other innovations like that. Do you think we are measuring the numbers correctly, and perhaps that might be part of the puzzle?
The economists who've looked most carefully at this idea of mismeasurement point out that the area where we're failing to measure output adequately is in computers and the digital revolution. And that, as I mentioned before, was going most rapidly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The people who studied this suggest that the extent of our missing the fruits of the digital revolution were greatest in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and have become less since then. In the particular case of the United States, our production of computers has largely shifted offshore, is largely imported. So the benefits of computers are not being produced by the domestic U.S. economy. They're being imported from abroad. And that's in contrast to the late 1990s, when much of it was produced within the United States. So that sense that we're missing the computers are just not part of our domestic economy anymore in terms of where they're being produced.
Okay, and I guess finally, people have suggested that the future is so unknowable that perhaps there are technologies being developed now, perhaps in energy efficiency, perhaps we're not very far away from free energy for mankind, or colonization of space, and all of these great things that we can't foresee now that will drive the next big boom in growth. What do you say about that? Is the future unknowable?
I think the future may be unknowable 50 or 100 years from now. I only forecast out 25 years, and I think we have the elements of the innovations that are going to be happening and are happening right now. We have robots, we have artificial intelligence, we've got progress being made in voice recognition, language translation. We've had the travel agent pretty much eliminated by e-commerce. We're seeing a steady growth of e-commerce. And we have the movement toward self-driving cars and trucks, which is only just beginning. And we can forecast that over the next 20 to 25 years, we'll make progress in the direction of those foreseeable innovations. So I draw a sharp line at 25 years, and I think the future is relatively unknowable after that.
Thank you very much. I've got to say, it's a fantastic book, not just because of this view about growth longer term and productivity, but it's also a very detailed analysis of how people lived throughout the last century or so, with lots of fantastic economic history as well as social history. So I very much recommend you read it. Sadly, that's two very pessimistic authors we've had in a row now in our series of videos. We had Martin Ford recently saying that technology was advancing so quickly that it would change mankind for the detrimental reasons, and now you saying technology is not advancing quickly, but still we're in a bad place. So I think next time we need to have an optimistic view of technology come and talk to us. So Elon Musk, if you're not doing anything next week, give us a ring. Thank you very much.